Yeah. I guess in a way, I mean, just that Jim's just shared testimony there, and that word came up, and I think really what I want to share is really a testimony about somebody in the Bible, somebody that we know very, very well, by the name of Peter, or Simon as he was called before. And sometimes we can kind of feel like, well, we know all about Peter, we know who he is and everything else, and yes, we do, but I just found thinking about him again, it was quite refreshing, but also I found it quite challenging. We're not quite at Pentecost yet, but we're not far off, and I've been reading Acts, and I actually was past that bit, but I think that's what prompted me thinking about Peter again. So really I just want us to look at Peter and just think of a few things. First of all, who was he, the man, Peter or Simon? What was he like? What kind of a person was he? What was his character? What was his mission? Did he have a mission? Had God got a mission for him? And what was his message? What message did he have to share in that mission? And what was the response to his message? So that's kind of where I want us to go. It might look like I've got a lot of pieces of paper, but it's because I've just scribbled things down. So who was who was he? Peter, the man. Well, we know that he was Andrew's brother. And I've just lost my first bit of paper, but never mind. Here we go. This is John chapter 1. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ." And he brought him to Jesus. And we don't hear a lot about Andrew, do we? But he had a big impact on his brother, who we do know a lot about. So I think we shouldn't lose heart on the people that we talk to and who we share with, because we don't know what God's going to do in their lives and how God is going to use them. And God used Peter there. What else do we know about him? Well, he was a fisherman. We know that in Mark chapter 1. I won't read all the verses, but I will read a few, so I'll be jumping about a little bit, because it's good to know that these are things that the Bible tells us about people. They're not just stories, but they're things that are written here for us to know. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. So, we know his name was Simon. We know he had a brother called Andrew. We know he was a fisherman. We know he was married. I'm not going to go to that one. Matthew chapter 8, verse 14 tells us that he was married. Where was he from? I think we've already referred to that he was from Galilee. In John chapter 1, verse 43, I won't refer back to that one, but I will mention one in Acts chapter 2, verse 7. And this was Peter, along with the other believers that were meeting together after Jesus had gone back into heaven, and they were waiting for the Holy Spirit to be given to them. So Peter is among these people. And in verse 7, it says, utterly amazed, they asked, this was the people who witnessed the Holy Spirit being given to the people there, are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in his own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? These were people from Galilee, Peter, a fisherman, and fishermen weren't given very high regard. They were kind of looked down upon a little bit. They were thought to not be very well educated. And yet, here they were speaking to these people from all these different countries. How on earth could that happen? What was going on? So he was from Galilee. We know that his name got changed later to Peter. Again, that's in John chapter 1. I won't read it, verse 42. And Jesus called him and he says, no, your name will be Peter, which means rock. I'm not going to go into that. So what was he like as a man? That's where he's from, but what was he like? I think you could probably all tell me things. I'm just going to read them out. You might think of other things. It might just stir you to think about again, who was he? What was he like? Well, he was a bit inconsistent, wasn't he? He was a bit kind of up and down, and if I'm honest, I can be like that. A bit like the wind blow this way and that way. He was often the first to speak up. He was often he was sometimes the first to speak and put his foot in his mouth, and then realise he hadn't quite got it right. He was sent by Jesus to prepare the place for the Last Supper. I guess we often think he's most well known for his mistakes and the things that he got wrong more than for the things that he did do. He was headstrong. He'd often speak, as I say, without really thinking. Let me see if I can get this right here. I've got that many bits of paper, apologies. This is one thing he did. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus began to speak to the people and tell them what was going to happen to him. He spoke plainly about the fact that he was going to suffer and he was going to die and he was going to rise again. And what did Peter say? Peter took him aside and rebuked him. You know, Peter taking Jesus aside and saying, rebuking Jesus. Wow. And what was Jesus' response? I thought this was quite interesting when I read this. Peter rebuking Jesus. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, what did he do? He rebuked Peter. It's like, okay, you're not getting this, Peter. You know, you're really not getting this. He says, you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Peter thinking he knew better than Jesus. But this is the Messiah, the Son of God. That's what his brother had said to him. His brother had come and said, here is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. And then Peter goes and takes him on one side and says, but, you know, you shouldn't really be saying this. I mean, I was a bit brass necked, to put it lightly. What else was he like? He was an excitable person, wasn't he? He was the one who ran to the tomb, along with John, I think it was, to see if it was really true what the women had said, that Jesus' body wasn't there. But he didn't just stop at running to the tomb, he just ran straight in. John kind of stopped and looked, but Peter, no, just in. And that's just what he was like. And what about the other time after, or subsequent to that? He'd kind of lost hope, I think, probably like lots of the disciples. They didn't know what was going to happen. And Peter says, oh, well, I'm going to go fishing, I'm going fishing. And some of the disciples say, yeah, we'll come with you. And off they go. And while they're out in the boat, Jesus comes along to the shore and calls out to them. And Peter's up. And that's Jesus. So he's off out the boat and down, straight in. Just impulsive. That's not always a bad thing. It just shows who he was, but that sometimes he could be a bit inconsistent. What did he say at one point? He said, if I'll never deny you. If I have to die, I'll die for you. I'll die for you. And yet 3 times, not long after that, he says, I don't know you. I don't know you. And we know, don't we, that afterwards Jesus spoke to Peter specifically and asked him a question, do you love me? 3 times. So he had the opportunity, and he did there, to affirm that, no, I do believe in you. Because he said, Lord, I know, I love you. I love you, you know I love you. He had that opportunity to declare that he did trust in Jesus. And I think, are there any similarities between Peter and me? I think Peter's one of those people that lots of us at different times, and some of the things he did and said, will say, yeah, I can be a bit like that sometimes. I can say one thing and do something else. So that's a little bit of who he was, who was he, what was he like, what did he see and what did he hear, what did he learn? Well, he saw the miracles that Jesus performed. He was there on most of them. But a lot of the time we read his name's there. He saw Jesus feeding 5,000 people. He had a very personal experience on one occasion, again, maybe kind of speaking a little bit out of turn, when he was asked by the religious people, does Jesus pay tax? And Peter said yes. So then he's in a bit of a spot of bother, and Jesus said to him, okay, go and catch this fish, and when you open the fish's mouth, you'll find a coin in it, and that'll be the tax for you and me. So Jesus was there, in a sense, helping Peter out with providing the money that he needed to pay the tax. He'd already said we should pay tax. Maybe he didn't have any money, we don't know. But and would that have been a test of his faith? He was a fisherman being told by Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, to go down and catch a fish, and there's going to be a coin in its mouth. I mean, as a fisherman, I'm sure if I was him, I'd be thinking, what? Fish don't pop up with coins in their mouth, But he went and he did it, and we know what happened. And again, this kind of inconsistency a little bit, and excitement. You remember when they were in the boat and the storm came up, and Jesus came walking to them on the water, and they were all, this ghost. And then Peter says, if it's really you, Lord, let me come to you. I mean, the chances of finding a coin in a fish's mouth it's not impossible, but walking on water, that is impossible. And now Peter's like, well, let me come to you. So he steps out, and it's fine until he takes his eyes off Jesus. And then what happens? We know. And it's not then, let me come to you, it's Lord, save me. when he starts to look at things around him, takes his eyes off Jesus, or he starts to do things on his own, he gets into trouble. And I know that can be so much like me. So, he listened to Jesus' teaching, he saw Jesus provide, he saw Jesus heal, so many other stories that we know of. But what about Peter? Was there a job for Peter to do? Was there a mission for him to do? And this is where we come into Acts. I'm going to skip all my bits of paper and move on to Acts. So, well, the first thing, I don't know if it was a mission, but the first thing Peter, along with the other disciples and the other believers at the time, were told to do was actually a very passive thing, and it was wait for the Holy Spirit to be given. And interestingly, before Jesus commenced his ministry, before he went out publicly for his ministry, the Holy Spirit was given to him when he was baptized by John in the Jordan. So there's clearly the Holy Spirit working there with Jesus for his ministry. And we're told to follow him. I will make you fishers of men, Jesus says. And so here you've got Jesus saying, before Peter and these others are sent out, wait for the Holy Spirit. And I don't know what they would have thought about that either. But we read what happens. And so we have Luke introducing Acts. And what is it about? It's about what Jesus began to do and to teach. That was going to be what they were going to be sharing. They were going to be sharing about that, but they needed the Holy Spirit to do that. What does it say? Verse 1. I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is a very important part of the Trinity. I'm not going into that, but sometimes we maybe don't acknowledge, perhaps is what I'm trying to say, what the Holy Spirit does in ministry, in mission. And I think if the people hadn't waited, would they have had that impact? It would have been within their own efforts, within their own strength, within their own power. But when the Holy Spirit came, these people that heard these Galileans, these uneducated people talking, acknowledged that this was something amazing. It was something beyond anything that these men could naturally do. And what is Peter's message? What does Peter have to say? And I found this quite interesting too. I'd never really thought about it. People think of Peter and maybe the others who were fishermen as being uneducated and kind of looked down on a little bit. You know, they're not like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and everything else. But in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, how many times does Peter first of all stood up to, in chapter 1, verse 15, in those days, Peter stood up among the believers, and then he talks, and he refers to the Psalms. So he's obviously got an understanding of the Old Testament. He refers to the Psalms about what was going to happen to Judas, and then to say to the people, we need to choose somebody to replace Judas. So he refers to the Old Testament there among the believers. And then we go into chapter 2, and we have the Holy Spirit coming. All of them, verse 4, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues. And then I read about all the people that were there and were listening. And the response of the people, they were amazed, they were perplexed. Well, what is all this? You know, how can these people do this? But some of them just thought, oh, this is nonsense. These guys must be just out of it. They're drunk. They're just babbling. They don't know what they're doing. And then Peter stood up with the 11. He was the spokesperson, but he had the support of those others around him. He stood up with the 11. He was the one that spoke. And he says they're not spoken. And then he says, verse 16, no, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. So he refers again to the Old Testament. He refers to I'm not going to read it all, but Joel. And I've lost my bit of paper, but in other places across the page, he refers to the Psalms again. So people thought he was uneducated, but he had a knowledge of the scriptures, and his message was from the Old Testament. So he wasn't saying the Old Testament isn't relevant anymore. He was pointing back to the Old Testament as to how that is going to show the fulfillment of Jesus coming. And what is the response to the people when they hear this? They're surprised that these are Galileans, and Peter then goes on to give this message from Joel, which ends with the words of chapter 2, verse 21. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And then he refers to other passages in the Psalms, as I say. And then in verse 36, therefore let all Israel be assured of this: God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified,